Colonel Montmorency, who was in Calcutta in '92, emerged from his retirement for the war. He wasn't very pleased with all he heard and all he saw, but whatever he felt, he tightened his belt and organized a corps. Poor Colonel Montmorency thought, considering all the wars he'd fought, the Home Guard was his job to do or die. But after days and weeks and years, bravely drying his manly tears, he wrote the following letter to the Minister of Supply. Could you please oblige us with the Bren gun, or failing that, a hand grenade will do. We've got some ammunition in a rather damp condition, and Major House has an arquebus that was used at Waterloo. With the vicar's stirrup pump, a pitchfork and a spade, it's rather hard to guard an aerodrome. So if you can't oblige us with the Bren gun, the Home Guard might as well go home.
On Sunday the 3rd of September 1939, at 11:15 in the morning, people across Britain gathered around their wireless sets to hear the news that would change their lives.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In the months following Neville Chamberlain's sombre broadcast, Britain became a frenzy of activity. The massive task of relocating nearly 3.5 million people from at-risk areas, Operation Pied Piper, swung into action. It was the biggest and most concentrated mass movement of people in Britain's history. The process of issuing gas masks to every member of the population, 38 million of them, began. And communities across the land took steps to protect themselves. There was widespread belief that a German invasion was imminent, and there were calls from civilians to be allowed to arm themselves to defend their homes and families. Prominent in this movement was the Legion of Frontiersmen, which had formed in 1905 to prepare patriots for war and foster vigilance in peacetime. The outbreak of war thrust them into the limelight. The government, though, was alarmed at the growth of these paramilitary groups outside of their control. With their broad-rimmed sombrero hats, smart tunics, riding breeches, spurs and war ribbons, the Legion of Frontiersmen cannot persuade the government to adopt them. This is a cause of intense disgruntlement to the gallant legionnaires. One of the few advocates of a civilian home defence force was the newly installed First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who would become a major figure in the Home Guard story. The first months of the war had been frantic, but when no invader set foot on our shores, and the threatened air raids and feared gas attacks didn't materialise, people began to relax. The enthusiasm for paramilitary organisations waned. There was even talk of the phony war. Everything changed in the spring of 1940. Hitler's Blitzkrieg His lightning war saw his army sweep through Belgium and Holland and across France with alarming speed. This war had suddenly become very real. By May, the British Expeditionary Force, the cream of the British Army, were pinned down on the beaches of Dunkirk, and the call went out for a flotilla of small ships to rescue them. The months that followed were some of the most extraordinary in modern British history. They saw the rise of the world's greatest civilian army, a remarkable force that became part of British folklore, and of course, the subject of one of our best-loved sitcoms. At the time, though, the situation was far from amusing. The might of the Nazi war machine was now massed across the English Channel, and the government found itself under renewed pressure to allow the population to take up arms to defend themselves. The press baron, Lord Kemsley, privately proposed to the War Office that rifle clubs be formed to make up the nucleus of the Home Defence Force. Labour MP Josiah Wedgwood wrote to the Prime Minister asking that the entire adult population be trained in the use of arms and given weapons to defend themselves. The Sunday Express called on the government to issue free arms licences and permits to buy ammunition to men possessing small arms, and the Sunday Pictorial asked if the government had considered training golfers in rifle shooting to eliminate stray parachutists. The government made its position clear, with a press release stating that it was the task of the army to deal with enemy parachutists, and civilians should not get involved in the fighting. To no avail. Private defence forces sprang up all over the country. Ministers were concerned that these uncoordinated militia groups would hamper the regular army during an invasion, but the population would not be denied the right to defend themselves. The government and senior military officers eventually bowed to the will of the people. Better to have an official civilian defence force under their control than any number of independent groups. On the 14th of May 1940, Secretary of State for War Sir Anthony Eden announced the formation of a new citizen army.
Since the war began, the government have received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages who are for one reason or another not at present engaged in military service, and who wish to do something for the defense of their country. Well, now is your opportunity. We want large numbers of such men in Great Britain who are British subjects between the ages of 17 and 65, to come forward now and offer their service in order to make assurance doubly sure. The name of the new force, which is now to be raised, will be the Local Defence Volunteer.
Perhaps it was no coincidence that the greatest advocate of a home defence force, Winston Churchill, had become Prime Minister 4 days earlier. The government had expected around 150,000 volunteers. In the first week, more than 250,000 men besieged police stations up and down the country to join up. By July, the number had increased to 1.5 million.
This questionnaire is addressed to civilians who are not in armament factories or in government service. Have you joined the Local Defence Volunteers? In this organization, you will find increasingly important work to do. You can carry on with your civil employment while discharging military duties. You can renew your acquaintance with firearms with all the self-confidence which the rifle gives you. Or if you're new to the rifle, you can quickly learn on the ranges how to handle and fire it.
That you're taking your first pressure and you're going to apply the second pressure by gentle movement from the first finger.
The LDVs at Bisley have been giving a good account of themselves. Then again, this organization contains a motorcycle contingent whose job will be very responsible if there is any breakdown in telephone communications.
Halt! Who goes there? And to the challenge comes the answer, the King. His Majesty then produces his identity card for inspection by the vigilant Home Guardsman. This is the human story of the King's arrival at Woodford, Essex, when he inspects 2,000 men of the local defence volunteers. Received by the Zone Commander, the Lord Lieutenant of the County, and the GOC London District, His Majesty witnesses many phases of Home Guard training. Over 80% of these volunteers are ex-servicemen and therefore well able to give a good account of themselves. Noticeable in the ranks, however, are men too young to serve in the fighting forces, but proud to be training alongside proven veterans of the last war. This enthusiastic citizen army comes under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Alan Brooke, the new CNC of the Home Forces.
So, the LDV was a formidable force. At least that's what the propaganda would have us believe. Of course, the reality was rather different, and cracks soon began to appear in the hastily conceived plans to mobilise the nation. The volunteers had expected to be part of an effective fighting force, but it soon became apparent that these ambitions weren't matched by the authorities. The first bone of contention involved the lack of uniforms. There was a good deal of frustration when it was announced that the LDV would receive only armbands to identify them. That situation was eventually rectified, but even worse was the shortage of weapons. The volunteers were surprised and alarmed that they weren't issued with proper firearms, making do instead with whatever they could lay their hands on. Some had privately owned shotguns, but others made do with pitchforks. There were even reports of some LDV units breaking into museums and appropriating whatever weapons they could find. Imagine the situation a local defence volunteer found himself in. He expected to face fully armed, highly trained German paratroopers, armed with a shotgun at best, possibly just a pitchfork. Their confidence wasn't helped by advice like this. One of the handicaps which the local defence volunteers suffer is the lack of a sufficient number of rifles with which to do their training. Much of the training, however, can be carried out with improvised implements. The various firing positions, for instance, can be taught and practiced with walking sticks or broomsticks. The weight and length will differ from those of the rifle, of course, but the men can be taught how to assume a comfortable and correct position for firing, so that when they actually have the rifles in their hands, they can assume the correct firing position instinctively. The Nazi High Command was scornful of what they called Britain's broomstick army, and Joseph Goebbels warned that if any of them were captured, they would be immediately executed. But were our dad's army intimidated? Not on your Nelly. There was a growing realisation that, despite its shortcomings, there was something rather special about Britain's ragtag army. Anthony Eden himself summed it up. No one will claim the LDV is a miracle of organisation, but many would claim that it is a miracle of improvisation, and in that way it expresses the particular genius of our people. The defence volunteers became adept at making the most of whatever was at hand. Patrols were carried out on foot, by bicycle, even on horseback. River patrols were often undertaken using the private boats of members. Armoured vehicles were made by adding steel plates to cars and lorries and mounting them with machine guns if they had them. The LDV also devised coded plans in the event of an invasion. The word Cromwell warned that a paratrooper attack was imminent. Oliver meant the invasion had commenced. The sound of church bells would serve as a call to arms, and ringing them at all other times was forbidden. Most of these arrangements were made ad hoc at a local level, which led to a good deal of squabbling about their implementation. The most common argument was who held the keys to the bell tower. The local vicar was often protective of his domain, while LDV commanders insisted that, in the interests of national security, they should hold the keys. Sounds a bit like the plot for a TV show.
You are a new corps, a corps with its traditions to make. But you have already got your motto, and your motto is, kill the Boche. In the course of your duty, you may have the luck to come in contact with the enemy. If you do, one of your duties is to shoot when you see a sitter, and shoot to kill.
While there was no doubting the commitment and courage of the LDV, their ability to withstand a full-scale invasion by crack German troops was still suspect. Winston Churchill, though, remained convinced that a citizen army was crucial to our survival. Such a force is of the highest value and importance. A country where every street and every village bristles with resolute, armed men is a country against which the tactics that destroyed the Dutch will not succeed. A country so defended would not be liable to be overthrown. In August 1940, he changed the name of the LDV to the Home Guard and issued orders that they were to be issued with automatic rifles, machine guns and grenades on a scale which represented full armament for 1 million men. Other changes included the granting of commissions to Home Guard officers, which would enable the Captain Manrings of Britain to command all local troops in an emergency. Training was also to be improved, and to help with this process, the Home Guard Pocket Manual was published. This contained all the information a citizen soldier would need to defend his homeland. Well, not quite, but it was a step in the right direction, and became essential reading for any dedicated member of the Home Guard. But not all members of the Home Guard had to rely just on the manual. Powerful figures in the intelligence services were convinced that a Home Guard trained in guerrilla warfare would make Hitler think twice about invading Britain. They called on Tom Wintringham, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, who set up a Home Guard training school at Osterley House near Hounslow. Here he taught guerrilla warfare, bomb making, and used the empty estate workers' homes to practice street fighting techniques. Around 5,000 members of the Home Guard were trained at Osterley and went back to their units to pass on their newly acquired knowledge. Not everyone in the establishment approved. Winston Churchill was one of Osterley's fiercest critics. While he saw the value of an underground army, he feared the growth of a private force that could one day be used against the government. The training camp closed in October 1940, but the canny Churchill had already set other plans in motion. In the summer of 1940, he approached Colonel Colin Gubbins to form a special, highly secretive auxiliary force who would be trained in the art of guerrilla warfare. To help organise this special unit, Gubbins enlisted Peter Fleming and Michael Calvert, who went on to set up the SAS. Recruiters were dispatched to scour the country for suitable candidates, who were usually selected from the more able members of the Home Guard. Although, as one senior officer noted, to compare them with the Home Guard was to compare the Brigade of Guards with the Salvation Army. The first stage of this dangerous journey began in the Wiltshire village of Highworth. Secrecy was crucial to the effectiveness of the auxiliaries, and a key figure in its clandestine operation was the modest and unassuming Mabel Stranks. She was the postmistress at Highworth, and the dependable face of village life, who sold the stamps and sorted the letters for more than 25 years. What no one, not even her close family, knew was that Mabel Stranks led a double life. New recruits were told to go to Highworth Post Office and make a specific request. Unknown to them, this was a password recognisable to Mabel Stranks. The recruit was told to wait while the postmistress went into her office, from where she secretly observed the newcomer, sometimes for hours, for any sign of suspicious behaviour. Once her decision was reached, she made a phone call to pass on a coded message. Shortly after, an unmarked car arrived to take the recruit to one of two destinations. Those who passed what was known as the Stranks test were taken to Coleshill House, 2 miles away, where the estate had been turned into a training camp. The ones who failed the test were taken elsewhere to be interrogated. It's thought more than 3,500 civilians passed through Highworth Post Office on their way to Coleshill House. Here, they were trained in the art of guerrilla warfare, which included everything from blowing up bridges to slitting throats, and going to ground and living off the land. They were even taught how to booby-trap toilets in the grand country houses the German hierarchy would have taken over had they invaded. When their training was complete, the recruits were formed into operational patrols of between 4 and 8 men, usually from the same area, with a good local knowledge. As cover, the men were allocated to Home Guard units and appeared to continue their lives entirely normally. By day, they were ordinary civilians, from doctors and vicars to farmers and poachers. Under cover of darkness, though, their secret lives began. The first task of each cell was to build an operational base, basically a concealed hideout from where they could mount covert missions, store weapons and ammunition, and enough food and water to last up to a month. It's thought there were around 1,000 of these hidden dens around the country, and their construction depended on the local area. In many parts they were simply large holes in the ground, with a log roof covered with earth and leaves. In Wales and the northeast, abandoned and forgotten coal mines were turned into excellent hideouts. In Cornwall, derelict tin mines served the purpose. Wherever they were made, the crucial factor in the siting of the operational bases was that they were impossible to detect. But creating these hideouts in total secrecy presented something of a problem, particularly if a sharp-eyed bobby was on the beat. One of the early auxiliaries was arrested by a police constable who wanted to know why he was sneaking around at night armed with a revolver. He spent several hours in a police cell until his intelligence officer bailed him out. After that, the members were issued with a document instructing any suspicious police officer not to question the bearer, but to phone a number. The main task of this underground army was to disrupt an enemy occupation force by mounting covert missions, or scallywagging as it was known, from which they acquired their nickname, the Scallywags. The Scallywags would wage a guerrilla war behind enemy lines. From their secret hideouts, they would destroy anything that might be useful to the invader, things like port facilities, railway lines and petrol stores. They would also mount raids on German supply lines, blow up vehicles and equipment, carry out assassinations of Nazi officers and, a little ominously, deal with collaborators. Auxiliaries expected to be tortured and executed if they were captured, and were ordered to shoot themselves or each other rather than be taken alive and interrogated. It was calculated that the longest an auxiliary could expect to survive behind enemy lines was 12 days. Not quite the image Dad's army conjures up. While the underground army prepared to fight to the death, the public were told what was expected of them. In June 1940, the Ministry of Information published a booklet called If the Invader Comes, which explained to civilians what to do and how to do it. It began, "The Germans threaten to invade Great Britain. If they do so, they will be driven out by our Navy, our Army and our Air Force. Yet the ordinary men and women of the civilian population will also have their part to play." Hitler's invasions of Poland, Holland and Belgium were greatly helped by the fact that the civilian population was taken by surprise. They did not know what to do when the moment came. You must not be taken by surprise. Read these instructions carefully and be prepared to carry them out. When Holland and Belgium were invaded, the civilian population fled from their homes. They crowded on the roads in cars, in carts, on bicycles and on foot, and so helped the enemy by preventing their own armies from advancing against the invaders. You must not allow that to happen here. Your first rule, therefore, is, if the Germans come by parachute, aeroplane or ship, you must remain where you are. The order is, stay put. The idea of sitting there waiting for German stormtroopers to smash the door in was obviously pretty unnerving. Even worse was rule number 4. Do not give any German anything or tell him anything. Hide your food and your bicycles. Hide your maps and see that the enemy gets no petrol. If you have a car or motor-bicycle, put it out of action when not in use. It's not enough to remove the ignition key. You must make it useless to anyone except yourself. Always carry pepper to throw in the enemy's eyes and a sharp knife to kill them if necessary. So we quaked in our boots, disabled our cars and sharpened our knives, while the operation to turn Britain into a fortress continued. Any German invasion would involve the landing of troops and equipment somewhere on the coast, the most vulnerable areas being the south and east coasts of England.
On the beaches of England, the children play no longer. For among the sand dunes move the troops in steel helmets and battle dress, and armed with Tommy guns that will cut a man in half at 200 yards. And every day the shorelines echo to the warning thunder of the coastal guns at target practice. Patrolling every moor and down are the Home Guard, the parachuters, whose job it is to destroy airborne troops before they can consolidate positions. Across the countryside, the church bells are ready to sound the tocsin, and the fields have grown a new crop, tank traps. In the byways and the lanes, every stranger is challenged and identified. On the main roads, every civilian driver stopped for examination. At concentration points from Aberdeen to the Isle of Wight, mechanized forces stand ready to rush at the first alarm to any threatened area.
In some places, whole villages became heavily defended fortresses, and in Kent and East Anglia, nearly half the civilian population was evacuated. Elsewhere in the country, the Home Guard manned observation posts and carried out patrols to watch for any sign of an invasion. Occasionally, though, they were a little overzealous. On the afternoon of Sunday the 30th of June 1940, 2 members of the Home Guard platoon in Bewdley in Worcestershire reported seeing paratroopers landing in nearby woods. These were nervous times, and the platoon commander, who also happened to be the local bank manager, issued orders to ring the church bells to warn that the invasion had started. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Bewdley platoon had a ring of men around the woods and set up roadblocks on the main roads. With nothing stirring in the woods, the Bewdley men fixed bayonets and advanced to carry out a thorough search. They found absolutely no sign of parachutes or paratroopers, which was just as well. The fine weather had brought many day trippers to Bewdley for a day by the river, and the military activity had brought many locals out to see what all the fuss was about. The Home Guard roadblocks caused traffic chaos in the town centre, and the attempts to check the identity cards of all passers-by was pandemonium. If German stormtroopers had emerged from the woods, they could have wiped out almost the whole of Bewdley's population in a matter of minutes. It was later deduced that the so-called parachutes were probably fresh-cut straw lifted up by air currents from 2 passing planes. The incident was covered up at the time for fear of denting confidence in the Home Guard, and the only damage done was a few red faces. So the people of Britain braced themselves for the onslaught, as ready as they would ever be.
All through the broad acres of Britain they are standing to, along the white walls of the Channel, on the red earth of Devon, in the marches of East Anglia. With every passing hour, this island fortress of Churchill and his people grows more formidable. Each day the tide of help from friends across the sea flows ever stronger, and deep-rooted in these British people, in the Cockneys and the Clydesiders, in the men of Bristol and Manchester, Cardiff and Middlesbrough, in the 7 million citizens of London, lies an inner strength, a stubborn calm which bomb and fire and steel cannot pierce. As the ships steam on up Channel, past the Lizard and the Needles and the towering cliffs of Beachy Head, they sight once more the watchtowers and the bastions of Churchill's Island. They stand unconquered as they have stood down 1,000 years of history, and still they throw their challenge across those 20 miles of water. Come, if you dare.
As it turned out, Hitler dared not. Against the odds, the RAF repelled attacks by the Luftwaffe, and Hitler wavered. Maybe he'd heard of our secret guerrilla army, or recognised the commitment of the Home Guard, even read a copy of If the Invader Comes, and knew he faced a population armed with pepper and sharp knives, who would give no quarter. Whatever his reasons, Hitler called off the invasion of Britain and decided instead to bomb the British people into submission. Meanwhile, the efforts to fully arm the Home Guard had continued, and by late 1940 it had amassed 847,000 rifles, 47,000 shotguns and 49,000 machine guns. However, as there were now nearly 1.7 million volunteers, it still left more than 700,000 men without a weapon. With the threat of invasion past and the aerial bombardment underway, the Home Guard found a new role. Initially, it helped the regular army man anti-aircraft guns. By 1943, it operated its own dedicated batteries of anti-aircraft guns and manned coastal defence artillery, thereby freeing up regular troops for duties overseas. By now, the mood of the nation was changing. The balance of the war had shifted in favour of the Allies, and Churchill and Roosevelt were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of occupied Europe. By June 1944, the largest invasion force in history was gathered along the south coast, waiting for the signal to sail. Home Guard units were ordered to man coastal gun batteries round the clock to defend the fleet against seaborne attacks. Meanwhile, operational patrols of the auxiliaries were deployed on the Isle of Wight to guard the vital Pluto fuel pipeline against German commando raids. The invasion of Normandy began on the 6th of June, D-Day. The offensive began with an intensive bombardment of the German positions, followed by the landing of 24,000 British, American and Canadian airborne troops. Then the huge fleet sailed, and the 1st Infantry and Armoured Divisions landed on the Normandy coast at 6:30 in the morning. 4 years earlier, our armies had been driven from this land in disarray. Now they were back. As the Allies pushed across France, belief grew that the end was in sight. But Hitler had one last deadly card up his sleeve. At 4:25 in the morning, on the 13th of June 1944, a terrific explosion rocked Grove Road in Hackney. 6 people were killed, and a number of houses were destroyed. Hitler's rockets, the dreaded doodlebugs, had arrived. To meet the new threat, anti-aircraft batteries were quickly repositioned along the south coast and manned by experienced Home Guard artillery units. The rockets left 6,000 dead and 18,000 injured, but it could have been a lot worse. Around 3/4 of the V-1s launched against Britain were brought down by anti-aircraft fire. The Home Guard, though, paid a heavy price. More than 1,000 were killed in the battle against the doodlebugs. The onslaught of the V-1s ended in August 1944, when the Allied forces captured the launch sites in France. On the 7th of September 1944, Home Secretary Herbert Morrison told the press, "Except possibly for a last few shots, the Battle of London is over." The next day, the first V-2, launched from Holland, struck the capital. Even so, it was decided that the role of our civilian army was at an end, and it was announced that it would stand down in December of that year. The Home Guard was determined to go out with a flourish.
7,000 Home Guards from all parts of Britain and Northern Ireland march in their stand-down parade before the King in Hyde Park. His Majesty, who was accompanied by the Queen and the 2 princesses, takes the salute. The procession takes 40 minutes to pass the saluting base. 7,000 men in 29 sections, 11 Home Guard bands. The honor of leading the great column went to the men of the Ack units, who helped fight the flying bomb. They were loudly applauded by the crowd. To all these civilians in battle dress goes the nation's heartfelt thanks. Their readiness to answer the country's call when invasion threatened saw us through an anxious time. And in 4 years we have seen the birth and formation of a well-equipped and capable force which in many ways has played a great part in the defense of Britain. Hyde Park Corner is reached, and the khaki column turns into Piccadilly. The heart of London is tightly packed with onlookers, largely composed of proud wives and children, come to watch Daddy in the big parade. The skirl of the pipe swings the feet of men from moors and mills, factories and offices, down towards Piccadilly Circus. Round the boarded-up statue of Eros, the crowds pack closer than ever. From doors and roofs and windows, and clinging to ledges and lampposts, the crowd pays its tribute to the men whose sacrifices to duty had enabled regular soldiers to relinquish home duties and go overseas. These patriots, who after their work would don their uniforms and stand guard on windswept beaches and desolate moors, who were ready when the enemy threatened to meet him wherever he might be found. This is their final parade. The youngest branch of the armed forces is the first to stand down. Home Guardsmen have done a fine job, and though they cease to exist as a force in being, from now they will remain ready to answer any emergency. Drawing towards the end of the 3-mile march, the procession approaches Marble Arch, a day to be remembered in the fine history of their comradeship in arms. The feelings of all are summed up in these words broadcast to the nation. His Majesty the King.
Officers and non-commissioned officers and men, you have served your country with a steadfast devotion. I know that your country will not forget that service.
The parade's brought to a close an extraordinary chapter in the history of our nation, although the memory of our Dad's army would live on, thanks in no small part to the mishaps of Captain Mannering and company. But that's only a small part of the story. On the day the Home Guard stood down, the Times recalled the very real contribution they'd made to the war effort. Not only this nation and empire, but the freedom-loving world at large have reason to be deeply grateful to the patriotic and self-sacrificing men of this unique force. In no other country in the world would it have been possible, even in circumstances of similar dire emergency to those in which we stood after the collapse of France in 1940, to enrol 1,750,000 staunch men, the majority of them trained old soldiers in the last war, in the matter of a few months. The Home Guard brought together men in different walks of life, some of whom found new comradeship in arms. Undoubtedly the Home Guard, inadequately armed as it was a crucial factor in Hitler's decision not to invade this country in 1940. The high state of efficiency which the Home Guard attained in later years was a guarantee to this island's integrity against enemy invasion. If not for them, it would have been impossible to plan our invasion of Europe on the scale on which it is now being undertaken. This nation should never forget the debt it owes to these unassuming heroes and the sacrifices they made.